is you're going to start by making a coil vessel. You need a piece of clay that will work both as your base as well as the coil walls. So to start off with, I've got a nice piece of clay, and I have more to go with later on. I'm going to slice off a nice chunk of the clay off from the top of that into like kind of a flatter piece. Can you see this? And so from there, I'm then going to take my tools in my hands and I'm going to pound that down. And we want to create the base to be the thickness that we want the vessel to become. So for me, I'm going to go with like a nice 1/4 of an inch, okay? And so from here, I need to determine what that size is going to be of my vessel for the base. The base is really important in understanding your proportions, because if you make a really large base, then that means your vessel has to become really large. If you start with a smaller base, your base will determine how small a vessel becomes as well. So make sure that you're understanding your proportions of your beginnings before you start to build. What we want to avoid is using a coil technique to create a base. So you might see some YouTube videos or seen in other demonstrations that taking a coil and kind of rolling it up into a coiled kind of rope and then scoring it. We don't want to do that. That can cause S-cracks in these vessels because we're taking them to high temperatures. Okay, so first and foremost, I've got my base and I've got to determine how big I want that to be. So I'm really only going to kind of cut away with my needle tool around the edges to take off my excess clay. Again, I'm going to bundle this all up into a ball so I can use that later on. And then from here, it's really important that we use the serrated rib to compress the clay particles back into themselves after they've been pressed out by the slab throwing. Okay, so from one side into the next to get that nice compressed base. Okay, so I've got that nice base. So from here, I'm going to take my serrated rib. It's really important to use that serrated rib. And I'm going to go around the edges to create that main beginning joinery of the vessel. Okay? So you can see that. From there, I'm going to set it aside, and now I'm going to take the rest of my clay, using my wire tool. I'm going to kind of slice this up into equal parts. Having a work area to coil build that gives you some room to kind of really stretch out your coils is really important. So I've got my 4 pieces of clay, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze this in my hands and make it elongated to make it easier to get this into the coil technique. And coiling is really, one of our most earliest man techniques of construction. We still use it today. I love the coil build. And so you can see as I'm rolling my coils, I'm extending this beyond my wrists to the tips of my fingers and then working my way back. Okay? And as I work, I want to get this coil to be the thickness that I am desiring for my vessel. And remember that my base is only 1/4 of an inch thick. So getting this to be about 1/4 or a 1/2 an inch would be ideal. I'm also probably going to thin it out a little bit as it gets scored and attached. But you can see that my coil is now nice and elongated and ready to be adhered. So as I have my base, I am now going to take a nice little brush, because my clay is a little dry. So I've got a nice brush to work with, those sumi brushes that we have, and I'm going to apply just a tad of water along that ring of my scored area. Okay. Now, secondly, I'm going to take my serrated rib and I'm going to score along the ridge of that coil. So you can see that I've scored along the ridge, and now I'm going to take the scored part of the coil and I'm going to attach it to the scored part of the base. So as I'm attaching, I'm not pinching and squeezing, I'm just pressing downward to make sure that everything is really well attached. And as I begin to turn, I'm going to attach and overlap on top of the piece that was previously there. From this point moving on, I don't need to worry about scoring in between each individual coil. It's really just about scoring the base to the coil itself. And then as I'm doing this, I'm compressing the clay. As I press down, I'm not pinching. Pinching is going to thin your walls. It's also going to expand your form. So you want to avoid any real pinching, even though that's our initial instinct. I'm going to get my next piece of clay. I'm going to pull out this coil again, starting just by pinching and getting it elongated. Then again, rolling with my wrists. And as I'm working, wherever it seems inconsistent, you can kind of see I'm working those areas a little bit more than other areas. And I'm working my way up and down the coil, getting a full circular rotation. I'm not just rocking back and forth. Rocking back and forth like a rocking chair is going to create flat spots in your coils, and we want to avoid that at all costs. Okay? So as I'm working, I want to make sure that this coil is the same thickness as the one I previously just did. And again, you can see it's nice and elongated. And what I think is really also important to keep in mind is that when you're coil building, if you want your vessel to start to work outward, think of it like a staircase. You're going to build your second coil just on the edge of the previous coil. Don't go too far over, but like halfway through is ideal. So I'm going to come in here, attach where I have the other one, and then start to work my way outward. And you can see that I'm not applying too much pressure, so I'm not deforming any of my coils, right? So let's do one more. Again, squeezing that clay. And I think it's best to get about 3 to 4 inches of coils before you start to smooth out the walls. Because we need to smooth out those walls inside and out so that everything is well adhered and scored together so it becomes one continual form. So making sure that you do that completely correctly. Okay. So I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure here. And as I work, I'm going to score along that and adhere to the piece. And as I work my way around, now I'm at about 4 inches, okay? And I want to just with my hands, I'm not, like I said, I'm not pinching, but I'm just aligning everything to get the profile, the side profile that I'm happy with. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take that serrated rib and that's serrated with the teeth. This is where coil building becomes really tricky. We need to support with the inside hand and using the side of the tool, like the little teeth and kind of curving, I'm using quite a lot of power. I'm going to score upward from the bottom, or you can work your way downward. It's whatever feels more comfortable to you. And as I'm working in my rotation, you can see that I'm fusing all of those coils together. What I'm not doing is just barely passing through it. When you just barely pass through it, you're not fusing them together. There's a big difference between the two, okay? So applying that pressure, but I'm also supporting with the inside hand so that I'm not making the vessel collapse. And as I work, I can rotate. Having a lazy Susan or a banding wheel also can help some in your ability to work around the vessel. If you have one, take advantage of that. But it is not necessary. You don't have to have a banding wheel by any means. And so as I work my way around, I make sure that everything's well adhered, and then supporting with the inside hand. So what's really tricky is getting that inside bottom connection right in through the bottom, okay? And so taking the edge of the tool, not holding it flat, but folding it sideways, I'm going to go into the inside of the vessel and just adhere the bottom of the vessel to the coiled wall. Just working in my rotation, making sure that that's well attached. You can see that on the inside, right? See, it's really well scored. And then again, supporting with the outside hand, I am now going to do that same scoring technique from the inside. So everything has to be well scored. Those scored coils should fuse together through the scoring technique to become one continual vessel, right? Where all those particles are aligned and working together to avoid cracks later on. Okay, so from here, I have now scored both the outside as well as the inside of my form, right? You can see that. And now I'm going to take my smooth rib and I'm going to start to smooth out all of the score marks, because that also needs to happen, right? We don't, in ceramics, a scored rib, which is a pretty universal tool, starts to be identified as like glue, right? So like if you were using crazy glue or Elmer's glue or epoxy and you left it all over the surface of whatever you were working on, you would identify that as glue. But in the ceramics community, scoring marks are looked at like glue marks. So making that disappear is really important. So from here, I'm now scoring all of these parts all together. And again, still continuing to support, using a lot of pressure, and fusing all those sections. So from here, I then would start to continue to build up and outward. That is the coiling method. So I'm going to show you a pot that I've been working on for a while that really kind of shows the gravity of how you can really use this technique to make very large, expansive forms. So let me grab one of those for you and open that. So here is a vessel that I've been working on, for a couple, maybe like a week or so. And you can start to see the extent of which I've started to build. So the clay that I started with was a different color than the clay, because I've been using reclaimed clay, recycled clay. So some of my recycled clay was lighter and some of it's a little bit darker, but that's okay, because I'm going to seal this whole vessel in porcelain slip to cover the whole piece. But you can tell that I have created the same beginnings here that are now in my larger vessel. And all that I did was started to build one coil onto the next and started to pull this form outward. So with having the advantage of the piece still being plastic and using your rib, if you want it to become rounder and more robust, you can support with that outside hand, right? You can support that outside hand and push from the inside to kind of create that more curvilinear shape, right? So you really want to think about your profile as you're building upward, just as I have done in this larger vessel that I'm working on, okay? So as you build, you can see that when I started, I worked outward, and then when I got to about the midpoint, I started to work back in, because I want this to be very spherical in its completion. And you can see at the top my scored marks on the inside, as well as the scored marks along the inside of the form. Okay? So please, taking advantage of all that coil building has to offer is really important. Big things to avoid with coil building is poor coil construction. So poor coil construction would include not really paying attention to the way you're building your coil. So when you're using the coil and you're just rocking back and forth, when I just sit and I rock back and forth, and you can tell that I'm rocking back and forth because all I'm doing is rocking, right? And my hands are all staying in one place the whole time. So what happens is my coil becomes thin and flat, and I also get thin parts of where I'm applying pressure, and where I'm not applying pressure, it stays fat. So it's really important that if this starts to happen, to correct yourself is to turn the coil on its high edge, push down to create more of a circular shape, and then go back in where it's thicker and only apply pressure there, right? So as I'm starting to make my corrections to my poor coiling, and I do full circular rotations, I then am able to create that nice circular coil that will work really nicely on my vessel.